Before we begin, you need to understand this molecule shouldn't exist in nature. It doesn't grow in forests or bloom in gardens. You won't find it in ancient texts or sacred rituals passed down through millennia. LSD is not a gift from the earth, refined over generations of human discovery. It is something else entirely. A laboratory accident, a chemical impossibility that became the center of a secret government program, a cultural revolution, and a moral panic that continues to shape drug policy to this very day. This is not a story about hippies dancing at Woodstock, though they are part of it. This is not a story about Timothy Leary preaching consciousness expansion, though he too plays his role. This is a story about power, control, and what happens when a substance designed in a Swiss pharmaceutical lab escapes into the wider world and refuses to be contained. Before we go further, I want to ask something of you. If you found value in this documentary, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. Your engagement helps this content reach others seeking the same truths. Now, phone away, distraction silenced, settle into your bed, and prepare yourself for a journey through one of the strangest, darkest, and most profoundly misunderstood chapters in modern history. What you're about to hear involves government agencies dosing unwitting citizens in the name of mind control. It involves utopian dreamers who believed a chemical could end war and dissolve the ego. It involves moral panic, propaganda, decades of prohibition, and scientific research frozen for half a century. The scope is vast, from a Basel laboratory in 1938 to the festival grounds of Burning Man today, from CIA safe houses to university research centers, from prison cells to psychedelic therapy clinics. The ancient substances, cannabis, opium, peyote, those had time, millennia for humanity to learn their contours, their dangers, their possibilities. But LSD burst into existence fully formed, potent beyond measure, active in quantities measured in millionths of a gram. Nobody was ready for what it would do. Not the chemist who created it, not the government that weaponized it, not the culture that embraced it, not the authorities that banned it. It began, as so many accidents do, with a chemist trying to solve a completely different problem. The year was 1938. Europe stood on the precipice of war. In Basel, Switzerland, a young chemist named Albert Hofmann worked in the pharmaceutical research laboratories of Sandoz AG, a company founded nearly a century earlier. His focus was ergot, a peculiar fungus that grows on rye and other grains, appearing as dark, elongated growths where healthy kernels should be. For centuries, ergot had been known as both poison and medicine. In medieval Europe, contaminated rye bread caused epidemics of ergotism, gangrenous limbs, convulsions, hallucinations, death. Yet in small controlled doses, midwives had long used ergot extracts to induce labor and stop postpartum bleeding. Hofmann's assignment was to isolate and synthesize the active alkaloids within ergot, searching for compounds that might have medical value, circulatory stimulants, respiratory agents, practical pharmaceutical applications. He worked methodically through derivatives of lysergic acid, the chemical backbone of ergot alkaloids. Each new compound received a number and sequence. On November 16, 1938, he synthesized the 25th lysergic acid derivative in his series, LSD-25, lysergic acid diethylamide. The initial tests on laboratory animals showed some stimulation, nothing remarkable. The compound was noted in the laboratory records and shelved. Hofmann moved on to other projects. 5 years passed. But something about LSD-25 lingered in Hofmann's mind. Later, he would struggle to articulate why he returned to it, a peculiar feeling, an intuition, a hunch that perhaps the compound deserved another look. On April 16, 1943, with Europe now fully engulfed in the Second World War, Hofmann resynthesized LSD-25 in his Basel laboratory. This is where history pivots on a moment of almost impossible chance. During the synthesis, Hofmann absorbed a minute quantity of the compound through his fingertips. Exactly how this happened remains unclear. Perhaps he touched his face. Perhaps the chemical penetrated his skin directly. The amount was microscopic, likely no more than 25 micrograms. He didn't notice. He continued working. Within an hour, Hofmann began to feel strange, restless, dizzy. His visual field began to shimmer and distort. Gripped by growing anxiety, he asked to leave work early and began the bicycle ride home through the streets of Basel. It was mid-afternoon. What followed was the first human LSD experience in history. The bicycle ride became a journey through dissolving reality. Hofmann later described it in his laboratory journal with the precision of a trained scientist trying to document something beyond language. Objects warped and breathed, colors intensified to impossible saturation, His neighbor's face transformed into a threatening, colored mask. Time stretched and fractured. He was convinced he was dying, that he had poisoned himself, that he was going insane and would never return. His neighbor called a doctor. The physician arrived, examined Hoffman, and found nothing physically wrong. Pulse slightly elevated, pupils enormously dilated, but no medical emergency. Slowly, over the course of hours, the effects began to subside. By the next morning, Hoffman felt normal again. Better than normal, he noted, refreshed. The world appeared vivid, newborn. 3 days later, on April 19th, Hoffman deliberately ingested what he believed to be a threshold dose for scientific observation, 250 micrograms. What he couldn't have known, what nobody yet knew, was that LSD is active at doses as low as 20 micrograms. He had taken more than 10 times the necessary amount. The second experience was even more intense than the first. But now Hoffman understood he wasn't dying. He was experiencing something unprecedented in pharmacology, a substance active in millions of a gram, a compound that could fundamentally alter consciousness while leaving the body essentially untouched. No respiratory depression, no organ toxicity, just the mind, unmoored from its ordinary constraints, tumbling through realms of perception that seemed impossible. Hoffman knew immediately that he had stumbled onto something extraordinary. Sandoz knew they had something unprecedented. They just didn't know what to do with it. In 1947, the pharmaceutical company began marketing Hoffman's accidental discovery under the trade name Delicid. But this was unlike any drug launch in history. Sandoz wasn't selling Delicid to hospitals or pharmacies. They were distributing it, often free of charge, to psychiatrists, psychologists, and researchers around the world. The company was less interested in profit than in understanding what exactly they had created. The substance was too strange, too powerful, too unprecedented to fit into any existing medical category. The initial hypothesis seemed reasonable enough. Because LSD produced hallucinations, disorientation, and profound alterations in thought and perception, Sandoz marketed it as a tool to induce what they called model psychosis. The idea was elegant in its simplicity. Psychiatrists could take LSD themselves and temporarily experience something resembling schizophrenia. They could walk for a few hours in the fractured reality of their most troubled patients, empathy through chemistry, understanding through temporary madness. And so they did. Throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s, hundreds of psychiatrists, psychologists, and researchers ingested LSD in clinical settings. They lay on couches in dimly lit offices, notebooks nearby, attempting to document the dissolution of their own minds. Many emerged from the experience profoundly moved. Some wept. Others described it as the most meaningful experience of their lives. This, they realized, wasn't just model psychosis. It was something far more complex. The research expanded rapidly. In Saskatchewan, Canada, 2 psychiatrists named Humphrey Osmond and Abraham Hoffer began administering LSD to patients suffering from chronic alcoholism. The results seemed almost miraculous. Patients who had been drinking destructively for decades suddenly stopped. They described profound spiritual experiences under the influence of LSD, encounters with something larger than themselves, a dissolution of the ego that allowed them to see their addiction from outside its grip. The relapse rates were stunningly low. Word spread. In 1956, Bill Wilson, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, tried LSD under medical supervision. He became a passionate advocate, believing the drug could enhance the spiritual awakening that was central to the AA program. For a time, it seemed possible that LSD might become a standard treatment for addiction. Other researchers explored different applications. At UCLA, psychiatrists gave LSD to terminally ill cancer patients struggling with existential dread and fear of death. After a single guided session, many patients reported that their terror had lifted. They could face death with equanimity, even peace. Children with severe autism, previously unreachable, seemed to briefly emerge from their isolation under LSD's influence, making eye contact, speaking words they had never spoken before. In 1954, the British writer Aldous Huxley published The Doors of Perception, his account of taking mescaline under the supervision of Humphrey Osmond. Though mescaline was a different compound, the book introduced a wider audience to the concept of consciousness expansion through psychoactive substances. Huxley and Osmond corresponded extensively, eventually coining the term
psychedelic, from the Greek words for mind and revealing.
Not a tool to simulate madness, but a tool to reveal the mind's hidden dimensions. The optimism was intoxicating. This was the post-war era of scientific triumph and faith in progress. Antibiotics had conquered bacterial infections. Vaccines were eliminating ancient plagues. Why shouldn't chemistry also revolutionize psychiatry? Better living through chemistry wasn't just a slogan, it was the spirit of the age. Even Hollywood took notice. Cary Grant, one of the most famous actors in the world, underwent LSD therapy with a Beverly Hills psychiatrist in the late 1950s. He spoke about it openly in interviews, describing how the experience had helped him confront childhood trauma and become, in his words, reborn. Other celebrities followed quietly. LSD therapy became a discreet fixture of elite Los Angeles psychiatric practice. By the early 1960s, over 1,000 research papers had been published on LSD. Studies spanned alcoholism, depression, anxiety, obsessive-compulsive disorder, sexual dysfunction, and end-of-life care. Tens of thousands of patients had been treated. The safety profile seemed remarkably benign. No overdose deaths, no organ damage, no physical addiction. The psychiatric community was cautiously thrilled. Perhaps this strange molecule from a Swiss laboratory would indeed revolutionize the treatment of mental illness. But while doctors saw a tool for healing, others saw a weapon. The early 1950s were defined by a particular species of terror. The Cold War had settled into its frozen posture, not hot war, but something more insidious. An ideological struggle played out through espionage, proxy conflicts, and a gnawing paranoia that the enemy might possess capabilities beyond comprehension. When American prisoners of war returned from Korea in 1953, speaking communist slogans, praising their copters, denouncing their own country, the American intelligence community faced a terrifying question: how? Had the Chinese and Soviets developed techniques to rewrite human consciousness? Was it torture, drugs, hypnosis, or some combination? Were there chemicals that could break a man's will, extract his secrets, or turn him into an unwitting agent of a foreign power? The fear was not abstract, it was visceral, immediate, and demanded a response. The response was MK Ultra. On April 13, 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles authorized a research program that would become one of the most notorious chapters in American intelligence history. The bull was ambitious and chilling: to explore methods of mind control, interrogation enhancement, and behavioral modification, to develop truth serums, to understand if consciousness itself could be weaponized. The budget was enormous, eventually reaching $25 million in 1950s currency, distributed across more than 150 individual subprojects. 80 institutions participated, including universities, hospitals, and prisons. Many researchers had no idea they were working for the CIA. Their grants funneled through front organizations with innocuous names. At the center of this sprawling apparatus stood a man named Sidney Gottlieb. A chemist with a clubfoot and a passion for folk dancing, Gottlieb would become known within the agency as the poisoner-in-chief. He was a true believer in the potential of chemistry to unlock the secrets of the human mind. And when he learned about LSD, a compound so potent that doses were measured in millions of a gram, capable of completely altering consciousness, he believed he had found his weapon. LSD became the centerpiece of MK Ultra. The experiments began small, contained within the agency itself. CIA officers were dosed at office parties and retreats, observed through two-way mirrors as they descended into confusion, paranoia, and kaleidoscopic hallucinations. The rationale was that agents needed to know what LSD felt like in case enemy operatives used it against them. But many of these men had no idea they were being drugged. They simply accepted a drink from a colleague, and hours later found themselves unmoored from reality, terrified and alone, with no understanding of what was happening to them. One of those men was Frank Olson, a biochemist working for the Army's Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick. On November 19, 1953, at a CIA retreat in rural Maryland, Olson's drink was spiked with LSD without his knowledge. He had a profoundly disturbing experience. In the days that followed, he became increasingly anxious, paranoid, talking about quitting his job, expressing moral concerns about the biological warfare research he was involved in. On November 28, 1953, 9 days after being dosed, Frank Olson fell to his death from a 10th-floor hotel window in New York City. The official story was suicide, the tragic result of underlying mental instability. Olson's family was told nothing about the LSD for 22 years. When the truth finally emerged in 1975, They pursued the case, believing Olson had been murdered because he was planning to leave the program and might talk. The true circumstances of Frank Olson's death remain unresolved to this day. What is certain is that he was dosed without consent, and 9 days later he was dead. But the experiments didn't stop, they expanded. In 1955, the CIA launched Operation Midnight Climax, a sub-project of MK Ultra so brazen it seems almost impossible. The agency established safe houses in San Francisco and New York City, furnished them like brothels, and hired prostitutes to lure unsuspecting men inside. The men, Johns seeking paid sex, would be offered drinks laced with LSD. Behind two-way mirrors, CIA agents watched and filmed as the drugs took hold. They observed the men's behavior, their vulnerability, their suggestibility. The operation was run by George Hunter White, a federal narcotics agent with a taste for bourbon and a willingness to ignore every ethical boundary. For nearly a decade, Operation Midnight Climax dosed countless men without their knowledge or consent, all in the name of understanding how LSD could be weaponized. The experiments reached further still. Federal prisons became laboratories. Inmates at facilities in Kentucky, Georgia, and California were offered reduced sentences in exchange for volunteering for drug studies. Many were given LSD repeatedly, sometimes for weeks on end, far beyond any therapeutic justification. Mental patients in hospitals, already vulnerable and institutionalized, were used as test subjects. Sex workers, drug addicts, and marginalized people, those society deemed disposable, were dosed and observed. Informed consent was a fantasy. Follow-up care was non-existent. The wreckage left behind was considered acceptable collateral damage. None of this was legal. The CIA's charter explicitly forbids domestic operations. MK Ultra violated the agency's founding mandate, violated the Nuremberg Code established after World War II to prevent the kind of unethical human experimentation the Nazis had conducted. Yet it continued throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, hidden by classification and bureaucratic compartmentalization. The scope was staggering. Over 185 different researchers participated. Thousands of people were dosed, many without knowing. The experiments ranged from observing people on LSD to combining the drug with sensory deprivation, electroshock, hypnosis, and other techniques designed to break down personality and rebuild it. The objective was always the same: control. The ability to extract information, implant suggestions, create amnesia, or turn a human being into something malleable and useful. Did it work? The answer is complicated. LSD did not prove to be a reliable truth serum. People on LSD were too unpredictable. Sometimes they babbled confessions, sometimes they became paranoid and silent, sometimes they dissolved into laughter or terror. The drug could not be controlled with the precision intelligence work demanded. But the research generated volumes of data about human psychology, vulnerability, and the fragility of consciousness. That knowledge would inform interrogation techniques for decades to come. And the moral cost? Incalculable. Lives were shattered, minds were broken. Frank Olson's family would spend generations seeking answers. Others who were dosed in Operation Midnight Climax, in prisons, in mental hospitals, would never know why their lives had unraveled, why they carried trauma they couldn't name. The architects of MK Ultra faced no consequences. Sidney Gottlieb retired quietly in 1973 and spent his later years tending goats on a Virginia farm. For a decade, the CIA poured LSD into America's shadows, but the drug had other ideas about where it wanted to go. In the summer of 1960, a 39-year-old Harvard psychologist named Timothy Leary sat by a swimming pool in Cuernavaca, Mexico, and ate 7 psychedelic mushrooms. It was an afternoon that would alter the trajectory of psychedelic history. Leary was conventional by the standards of his profession, published researcher, clinically trained, focused on personality assessment and psychotherapy. He had come to Mexico on vacation with little interest in consciousness exploration, but the mushrooms dissolved that version of Timothy Leary entirely. He would later describe those hours as the deepest religious experience of his life, more profound than anything he had encountered in books or therapy. He felt his ego disintegrate, his sense of self expand beyond the boundaries of his skin to encompass everything around him. Time became meaningless. The categories that structured ordinary consciousness, subject and object, self and other, past and future, melted into a unified field of awareness. When he returned to himself hours later, Timothy Leary was convinced he had glimpsed something essential about human consciousness, something that psychology
had been fumbling toward but never quite reached. He returned to Harvard obsessed. With his colleague Richard Alpert, a young psychology professor who would later become the spiritual teacher Ram Dass, Leary launched the Harvard Psilocybin Project in 1960. The early work was genuinely idealistic, even rigorous. They designed controlled experiments, recruited volunteers, measured outcomes. The Concord Prison Project aimed to reduce recidivism by giving inmates psilocybin in group therapy settings, helping them confront the patterns that had led to incarceration. Early data suggested it worked. Prisoners who underwent the sessions seemed less likely to return to prison, though these numbers would later be disputed and criticized. The most famous experiment came on Good Friday, April 20th, 1962. In the basement chapel of Boston University's Marsh Chapel, 20 divinity students participated in a double-blind study. Half received psilocybin, half received a placebo. Upstairs, a Good Friday service played over loudspeakers, hymns, prayers, the story of crucifixion and resurrection. The students who had received psilocybin reported overwhelming mystical experiences, encounters with the divine, sensations of unity with God and the universe. They wept, they prayed. Some struggled to remain seated. The experiment became known as the Miracle of Marsh Chapel, and it seemed to prove that psychedelics could reliably occasion genuine religious experiences, not mere hallucinations, but encounters with transcendence itself. But something was shifting in Leary. The scientist was giving way to the evangelist. He began speaking about set and setting, the idea that the psychological mindset and physical environment determined the nature of a psychedelic experience far more than the drug itself. This was true and important, a real contribution to understanding these substances. But Leary increasingly prioritized the mystical experience over the data, the revelation over the research. When he tried LSD for the first time in 1962, far more potent than psilocybin, the transformation completed. He became a true believer, convinced that LSD was not just a therapeutic tool, but a key to human evolution, a chemical catalyst that could expand consciousness and usher in a new era of peace and enlightenment. The scientific protocols began to crumble. Leary started holding psilocybin and LSD sessions at his home near campus. Graduate students attended, then undergraduates. The sessions became less clinical, more spiritual, more chaotic. Rumors circulated, parents complained. Harvard's administration grew alarmed. Leary was giving powerful psychoactive drugs to students outside any institutional oversight, blurring the lines between research and proselytizing, between therapy and indoctrination. In May 1963, Harvard fired both Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert for ethics violations. The official reasons included giving psilocybin to undergraduates and conducting unsupervised experiments. But the deeper issue was that Leary had abandoned the scientific method entirely. He had become a prophet of a pharmaceutical gospel. Undeterred, Leary moved to Millbrook, a sprawling 64-room estate in upstate New York provided by William Mellon Hitchcock, heir to a banking fortune. Millbrook became a psychedelic commune, a laboratory of consciousness where the boundaries between research, spirituality, and hedonism dissolved completely. Leary held court, gave lectures, dosed visitors, and cultivated his image as a countercultural guru. The media loved him. He appeared in Life magazine, on television talk shows, eloquent and charismatic, speaking in the language of liberation and transcendence. In 1967, he coined the phrase that would define him: turn on, tune in, drop out. It was catchy, vague enough to mean anything, and perfectly calibrated to enrage the establishment while thrilling young people hungry for alternatives to their parents' world. Timothy Leary was a brilliant communicator. He had a gift for translating complex ideas into accessible language, for making the mystical seem within reach. But he was a terrible scientist. His data was sloppy, his methods undisciplined, his ego unchecked. In his rush to evangelize, he destroyed the credibility of legitimate psychedelic research. The Concord prison data would later be reanalyzed and found far less impressive than initially claimed. The Marsh Chapel experiment, while genuine in its findings, became tainted by association with Leary's later excesses. He wanted to save the world. Instead, he gave the authorities exactly the target they needed. As Leary preached consciousness expansion to the privileged, the drug was quietly spreading into the streets. The mid-1960s witnessed something unprecedented in pharmaceutical history, a laboratory compound escaping institutional control and flowing into the counterculture like water finding its level. LSD was still legal in most states until 1966.
Order it through certain suppliers. Researchers gave it away. And in the bohemian neighborhoods of American cities, particularly San Francisco, it began to circulate with increasing frequency among artists, musicians, students, and those who sensed that the straight world their parents inhabited was suffocating them. In 1965, a novelist named Ken Kesey, flush with royalties from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, assembled a group he called the Merry Pranksters. They painted a school bus in psychedelic colors, named it Further,
and drove across America distributing LSD at events they called acid tests. These weren't clinical sessions or spiritual retreats. They were parties, happenings, multimedia chaos, strobe lights, experimental films, music provided by a local band called the Grateful Dead, and enormous quantities of LSD dissolved in punch bowls and offered freely to anyone curious enough to drink. The writer Tom Wolfe would later chronicle this period in the electric Kool-Aid acid test, capturing the anarchic energy of a moment when a powerful psychoactive substance became a social sacrament. And then there was Owsley Stanley III, known simply as Bear. A sound engineer and self-taught chemist, Owsley began producing LSD in his private laboratory in 1965. Unlike the pharmaceutical-grade Sandoz product, Owsley's acid was made for the underground, pressed into tablets or dropped onto blotter paper, distributed by the hundreds of thousands, eventually millions, of doses. His product was legendarily pure, his standards obsessive. Owsley acid became synonymous with quality, and he gave much of it away for free or sold it at cost. For him, LSD was not a commodity, but a catalyst for consciousness, a tool to wake people from the American dream he saw as a nightmare of conformity and violence. By 1966, LSD had found its geographic and spiritual home, Haight-Ashbury, a neighborhood in San Francisco where Victorian houses could be rented cheaply and the city's bohemian tradition ran deep. Young people began arriving by the hundreds, then thousands, drawn by rumors of a new way of living, communal, creative, chemically expanded. Head shops opened, selling rolling papers, incense, posters printed in swirling psychedelic colors. Rock bands formed in living rooms and garages. The Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, Big Brother and the Holding Company, they soundtracked the acid experience, long improvisational jams designed to accompany and enhance the trip. On January 14, 1967, the Human Being gathered 30,000 people in Golden Gate Park. Timothy Leary was there, preaching consciousness expansion. Allen Ginsberg chanted, the Grateful Dead played, Owsley distributed his purest acid. The event was covered by national media, and the coverage carried a message to every disaffected teenager in America. Something is happening in San Francisco, something new, something better. The summer of love followed. In the summer of 1967, over 100,000 young people flooded into Haight-Ashbury. They slept in parks, on floors, in crash pads. They dropped acid and wandered the streets in face paint and flowing clothes. They believed with the fervor of true believers that LSD could end war, dissolve the ego, create a society based on love rather than competition. It was utopian, naive, beautiful, and unsustainable. The dream was real to those living it. Under the influence of LSD, the world did seem newly permeable, full of wonder, interconnected in ways ordinary consciousness obscured. The boundaries between self and others softened. Music became architecture, colors spoke. The possibility of a different way of being felt not like fantasy, but like direct perception. This wasn't delusion. It was the pharmacological reality of LSD temporarily reorganizing neural networks, allowing parts of the brain that normally operate in isolation to communicate with each other. But the insights gained in that state often dissolved upon return, and translating them into lasting social change proved impossible. And there were darker edges beginning to show. Bad trips became more common as LSD spread beyond experienced users into the hands of teenagers with no preparation, no guidance, no understanding of set and setting. People took too much or took it in chaotic environments and found themselves trapped in psychological horror with no way out. Panic attacks, paranoia, psychotic breaks that sometimes lasted days. The media seized on these stories with voyeuristic intensity. Teenagers staring at the sun and going blind, someone believing they could fly and leaping from a window. Many of these stories were exaggerated or fabricated, but some were real. LSD was not inherently dangerous, but it was powerfully unpredictable, and in the wrong circumstances, it could traumatize. Street acid also became increasingly impure. Dealers cut it with cheaper compounds, STP, PCP, amphetamines, or sold entirely different drugs as LSD. There was no quality control, no dosage standardization, no safety net. The free clinic opened in Haight-Ashbury in June 1967, specifically to treat bad trips and overdoses from adulterated drugs. Young runaways arrived in San Francisco seeking utopia and found exploitation, sexual predators, and substances that shattered rather than expanded their minds. By the end of 1967, Haight-Ashbury was littered with the casualties of its own optimism.
The original residents, those who had built the scene with genuine idealism, held a mock funeral called the Death of Hippie, declaring the summer of love dead and the neighborhood overrun by gawking tourists and opportunists. The dream had collapsed under its own weight, unable to scale, unable to sustain itself once the cameras arrived and the masses followed. But the damage to LSD's reputation was done. The utopian vision and the cautionary tales had become inextricably tangled, and the authorities were watching, waiting for the right moment to act. The summer of love was also the summer the backlash began. By 1966, LSD had become impossible for the establishment to ignore. What had begun as a psychiatric research tool confined to laboratories and clinics had escaped into the streets, into the hands of college students and countercultural rebels who explicitly rejected everything mainstream America held sacred. They opposed the Vietnam War. They questioned authority. They grew their hair long and lived communally, and claimed that a chemical compound had shown them a better way to exist. For conservative politicians and anxious parents, LSD became a convenient scapegoat for everything threatening about the cultural upheaval of the 1960s. The media frenzy began in earnest. Life magazine, Time, Look, publications that reached millions of American households, ran sensationalized stories about LSD's dangers. The coverage focused obsessively on the worst possible outcomes: teenagers jumping from windows believing they could fly, young people staring directly at the sun and permanently blinding themselves, psychotic breaks that left promising students institutionalized for life. Many of these stories were exaggerated, some were entirely fabricated, but they circulated as fact, repeated until they became part of the cultural mythology surrounding LSD. One of the most damaging claims came from a 1967 study by Dr. Myman Cohen, a geneticist who reported that LSD caused chromosomal damage and could lead to horrific birth defects. The research was preliminary, poorly controlled, and based on a tiny sample size, but the media ran with it. Headlines screamed warnings about LSD breaking chromosomes and creating a generation of deformed children. The image was viscerally terrifying: invisible damage at the cellular level, a poison that attacked not just the user but their unborn children. Later research would thoroughly debunk Cohen's findings, showing that LSD caused no more chromosomal damage than aspirin or caffeine, but the retraction received a fraction of the attention. The damage was done. Urban legends metastasized. The story of the teenager who took LSD and became convinced he was a glass of orange juice, forever terrified someone would tip him over. The college student who went insane from a single dose and spent the rest of his life believing he was trapped inside an orange, trying to peel himself. These stories had no factual basis, no verified sources, but they spread through school assemblies and church basements and parental warnings, becoming folklore that shaped public perception far more effectively than any scientific data. Then came the Diane Linkletter tragedy. In October 1969, Diane Linkletter, the 20-year-old daughter of the famous television host Art Linkletter, jumped to her death from her sixth-floor apartment in Los Angeles. Her father immediately blamed LSD, claiming she had been on an acid trip when she jumped. The media amplified his grief and his accusation. Art Linkletter became a spokesperson for anti-drug campaigns, appearing on television, testifying before Congress, turning his daughter's death into a moral crusade against LSD. The toxicology report found no LSD in Diane's system. She had a history of depression. But these facts were barely reported. The narrative had been set: LSD kills. Politicians seized the opportunity. Conservatives had long been looking for ways to undermine the counterculture and the anti-war movement, and LSD provided the perfect target. They could paint young protesters not as principled dissenters, but as drug-addled, mentally unstable threats to social order. LSD became a proxy for everything threatening about the youth rebellion: the rejection of traditional values, the questioning of authority, the growing opposition to the Vietnam War. On October 6, 1966, California became the first state to criminalize LSD possession. Other states followed rapidly. On October 24, 1968, federal law made LSD possession illegal nationwide for the
Staggers-Dodd bill. The penalties were severe: years in prison for possession, decades for distribution. And in 1970, the Controlled Substances Act placed LSD in Schedule I, the most restrictive category, reserved for drugs deemed to have no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. The research collapsed almost overnight. Scientists who had spent years studying LSD's therapeutic potential suddenly lost their DEA licenses. Universities terminated grants. Studies that were midway through data collection were abandoned. The Spring Grove experiments on end-of-life anxiety, the Saskatchewan alcoholism research, the UCLA work with autistic children, all of it ground to a halt. Researchers like Stanislav Grof, who had conducted thousands of LSD sessions and published groundbreaking work on the therapeutic applications of psychedelics, were forced to leave the country or abandon their life's work entirely. By the early 1970s, legitimate psychedelic research had effectively ended in the United States. Over 1,000 published studies, decades of accumulated knowledge, thousands of patients who had been helped, all of it dismissed, buried, forbidden. The potential to treat depression, PTSD, addiction, and existential distress in terminal patients would remain locked away for nearly 50 years, sacrificed to moral panic and political expediency. The truth didn't matter. The science didn't matter. LSD had become a symbol, and symbols are more powerful than facts. But the ban didn't end the story. It pushed LSD underground, where it would fuel a very different kind of revolution. When federal law criminalized LSD in 1968 and Sandoz ceased all production, the pharmaceutical supply vanished. But the demand did not. Hundreds of thousands of people had experienced LSD during the 1960s and wanted access to continue. The counterculture had adopted it as a sacrament. Festival culture, the Grateful Dead tour scene, the emerging rave movement, all of these communities considered psychedelics essential to their identity. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does the black market. Where legal production ended, outlaw chemists began. Making LSD is extraordinarily difficult. Unlike cannabis, which requires only seeds and sunlight, or even methamphetamine, which can be cooked in makeshift labs with dangerous but accessible chemicals, LSD synthesis demands advanced chemistry knowledge, sophisticated laboratory equipment, and precursor materials that are watched closely by federal agencies. The key precursor is ergotamine tartrate, derived from the same ergot fungus Albert Hofmann had worked with decades earlier. Ergotamine is controlled, tracked, its sale monitored by the DEA. Obtaining it requires either diversion from pharmaceutical supply chains or elaborate smuggling operations. The synthesis itself is a multi-step process requiring precise temperature control, an oxygen-free environment, and the ability to work with hazardous reagents. A single mistake can ruin an entire batch, or worse, cause an explosion or release of toxic fumes. Most chemists fail. Those who succeed are rare, highly skilled, and operating in constant danger of federal prosecution. Yet some succeeded spectacularly. In the late 1960s, a group called the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, based in Laguna Beach, California, became the primary LSD distribution network in the United States. They were idealists, spiritual seekers who believed they were engaged in a mission to expand consciousness and usher in a new age of peace. Their chief chemists were Nick Sand and Tim Scully, two brilliant young men who perfected the synthesis of orange sunshine, a particularly pure and potent form of LSD pressed into orange tablets. Between 1969 and 1973, they produced millions of doses, distributed through the Brotherhood's network to Grateful Dead concerts, college campuses, and communes across America. Nick Sand was a true believer. He saw LSD not as a drug, but as a tool for spiritual evolution, something that could help humanity transcend its violent, ego-driven nature. He operated with a strange combination of scientific rigor and mystical purpose, viewing each batch as an act of service. But the DEA was closing in. In 1974, Operation Julie, an international investigation spanning the United States and United Kingdom, resulted in the arrest of over 120 people involved in LSD production and distribution. The Brotherhood of Eternal Love was dismantled. Nick Sand fled to Canada, then to other countries, evading capture for decades before finally being arrested in 1996. He served time and was released, never renouncing his belief that what he had done was morally necessary. The DEA estimated throughout the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s that roughly 90% of the LSD supply in the United States came from fewer than a dozen chemists. Each arrest created a drought, sometimes for months or years, until someone else learned the synthesis and filled the gap.
Agency tracked these individuals obsessively, dedicating enormous resources to identifying and capturing them. LSD production was treated as a national security issue, not because the drug was particularly dangerous, but because it represented ideological resistance. The most significant bust came in November 2000. William Leonard Picard, a Harvard-educated chemist with a legitimate academic background in drug policy research, was arrested in a decommissioned missile silo in rural Kansas. The facility was equipped with state-of-the-art laboratory equipment, temperature-controlled synthesis chambers, and enough precursor materials to produce millions of doses. The DEA called it the largest LSD laboratory in history. Picard was sentenced to life in prison without parole, later reduced to 20 years. He was released in 2020, an old man who had spent 2 decades behind bars for manufacturing a substance with no lethal dose and no physical addiction potential. Yet even with Picard's arrest, LSD never disappeared.
The Grateful Dead tour scene kept it circulating from the 1970s until Jerry Garcia's death in 1995, creating a mobile distribution network that followed the band from city to city. By the 1990s, the rave scene had embraced LSD alongside MDMA, and a new generation discovered it in warehouses and desert gatherings. The doses became smaller, less consistent, sometimes adulterated with research chemicals or other compounds, but the substance persisted. The outlaw chemists operated with a strange blend of technical brilliance and ideological commitment. They were criminals under federal law, facing decades in prison if caught, yet many saw themselves as serving a higher purpose. They believed LSD could change consciousness, reduce violence, open minds. Whether that belief was justified or delusional remains an open question. What is certain is that they kept the synthesis alive through decades of prohibition, ensuring that LSD never vanished entirely from the cultural landscape. While chemists played cat and mouse with the DEA, the government's original experiments were finally coming to light. On December 22, 1974, investigative journalist Seymour Hersh published a bombshell article in the New York Times. The CIA, he reported, had conducted illegal domestic surveillance operations, spying on American citizens, infiltrating anti-war groups, compiling dossiers on political dissidents. The revelation triggered a political earthquake. Congress demanded answers. The public, already disillusioned by Watergate and the Pentagon Papers, was primed to believe the worst about government secrecy and abuse of power. What began as an investigation into domestic spying soon uncovered something far stranger and darker. In 1975, two parallel investigations commenced: the Church Committee in the Senate, led by Senator Frank Church of Idaho, and the Rockefeller Commission, a presidential panel headed by Vice President Nelson Rockefeller. Both were tasked with examining CIA misconduct. As investigators dug through classified files and interviewed former agents, the name MK Ultra began to surface. Whispers of mind control experiments, LSD given to unwitting subjects, secret safe houses, projects with names like Midnight Climax and Artichoke. In June 1975, the Rockefeller Commission released its findings. The CIA had indeed conducted illegal experiments on American citizens, dosing them with LSD without their knowledge or consent, observing the results, and in some cases causing lasting psychological harm. The scope was staggering, but the full details remained elusive. Sidney Gottlieb, the chemist who had overseen MK Ultra for 2 decades, had retired in 1973. On his way out, he had ordered the destruction of MK Ultra's records. Boxes of files were shredded, burned, erased. The institutional memory of 2 decades of unethical experimentation was deliberately obliterated. But Gottlieb had made a mistake. In his haste to destroy the operational records, he overlooked the financial documents. Approximately 20,000 pages of budget records, invoices, and payment receipts had been misfiled in a separate archive. When these were discovered in 1977, they provided enough detail to reconstruct the outlines of MK Ultra, the institutions involved, the researchers who had been funded, the scale of the operation. 185 researchers, 80 institutions, including prestigious universities and hospitals, subprojects spanning hypnosis, sensory deprivation, electroshock, and psychoactive drugs, and at the center of it all, LSD. The Church Committee hearings were public, televised. Americans watched as CIA officials testify, often evasively, about programs with clinical names that concealed human suffering. They learned about Operation Midnight Climax, the San Francisco safe houses where prostitutes lured unsuspecting men to be dosed and observed. They learned about the Army's parallel experiments at Edgewood Arsenal.
In Maryland, where over 7,000 soldiers between 1955 and 1975 had been exposed to LSD, BZ, and other incapacitating agents, many without full informed consent. Some told only that they were testing protective equipment against chemical weapons. And they learned about Frank Olson, the biochemist who had fallen from a hotel window in 1953, whose death had been ruled a suicide, whose family had been told nothing about LSD. 22 years later, the truth emerged. Frank Olson had been dosed without his knowledge 9 days before his death. He had become deeply disturbed, morally conflicted about the biological warfare work he was involved in. The CIA claimed his death was a tragic consequence of underlying mental instability exacerbated by the drug. His family believed otherwise, that Olson had been planning to leave the program, that he knew too much, that his death was not suicide but murder disguised as one. In 1976, President Gerald Ford invited the Olson family to the White House and issued a formal apology. The government offered a settlement of $750,000, but the Olsons wanted more than money. They wanted the truth, a full accounting, criminal prosecutions. They received none of those things. In 1994, Frank Olson's body was exhumed and examined by forensic pathologists. The evidence suggested he had been struck on the head before going out the window, inconsistent with suicide. But by then, too many years had passed. Witnesses were dead. Records were destroyed.
the truth remained locked behind classification and the statute of limitations. There were other casualties, though most remained nameless. The men dosed in Operation Midnight Climax, who went home to their families confused and traumatized, never knowing why. The prisoners who volunteered for experiments in exchange for reduced sentences, only to be given LSD repeatedly for weeks or months, far beyond any conceivable therapeutic purpose. The mental patients in institutions who were used as test subjects, their consent manufactured or coerced, their suffering dismissed as irrelevant. These people had no recourse. Most never knew what had been done to them. Those who did found that suing a government meant confronting sovereign immunity, the legal doctrine that the state cannot be sued without its consent. A handful of lawsuits succeeded, mostly through settlements rather than court victories, but the compensation was paltry compared to the harm, and no one was criminally prosecuted. Sidney Gottlieb was never charged. He lived quietly on a farm in Virginia, raising goats and tending his garden until his death in 1999. Richard Helms, the CIA director who had overseen parts of MKUltra, received a suspended sentence for lying to Congress about an unrelated matter, but faced no consequences for the mind control experiments. The institutional apparatus that had authorized, funded, and executed these programs remained intact. The revelations did prompt reforms. The CIA's charter was clarified to explicitly forbid domestic operations. Oversight committees were strengthened. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act established judicial review for certain intelligence activities. But these reforms were procedural, bureaucratic. They did not address the fundamental moral failure that the American government, barely a decade after the Nuremberg trials had established the principle of informed consent and condemned Nazi human experimentation, had conducted its own unethical experiments on unwitting citizens. The full scope of MKUltra will never be known. The destroyed documents took too many secrets with them. How many people were dosed? How many lives were irreparably damaged? What other experiments, still classified or destroyed, were conducted under different code names? These questions have no answers. What is documented, beyond dispute, is that the United States government broke its own laws, violated the Nuremberg Code it had helped establish, and experimented on its own citizens in pursuit of weapons of consciousness. And when the truth emerged, the response was apologies and settlements, but no justice, no accountability, no reckoning proportionate to the crime. The revelations should have prompted a national reckoning. Instead, the war on drugs only intensified. But before we continue, we need to pause and acknowledge something that both the government propaganda and the countercultural evangelists often ignored. LSD can cause real harm, not the fictional chromosomal damage or made-up stories about teenagers believing they're orange juice, real psychological harm. For some people, LSD triggers experiences of overwhelming terror that don't end when the drug wears off. Hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, HPPD, leaves some users with permanent visual distortions, trails behind moving objects, geometric patterns overlaying their vision, walls that breathe. These perceptual changes can persist for months,
Years, sometimes permanently. For individuals with latent schizophrenia or other psychotic disorders, LSD can act as a trigger, precipitating breaks from reality that might have remained dormant otherwise. The drug doesn't cause schizophrenia, but in vulnerable individuals, it can open doors that cannot be closed. The most famous casualty was Syd Barrett, founding member and creative force of Pink Floyd. Between 1966 and 1968, Barrett used LSD heavily, frequently, in doses and circumstances that would be considered reckless by any standard. Those who knew him watched his personality fragment. He became unpredictable, unable to perform, staring blankly on stage or playing the same chord for an entire concert. By 1968, he was no longer functional as a musician. Pink Floyd replaced him and continued without him. Syd Barrett spent the rest of his life in varying states of withdrawal and psychological distress, never fully recovering the person he had been before. Whether LSD caused his condition or merely revealed underlying mental illness remains debated, but the trajectory is undeniable. Heavy psychedelic use coincided with the disintegration of a brilliant mind. There were others, musicians, artists, people drawn to LSD's promise of expanded consciousness, who found instead that their minds expanded beyond their ability to reassemble them. Some recovered, some did not. The counterculture preferred not to talk about these casualties because acknowledging them complicated the narrative that LSD was a tool of liberation. But they existed, and their suffering was real. Yet context matters enormously. Millions of people used LSD during the 1960s and 1970s.
The Woodstock generation, the Grateful Dead tour scene, festival culture, hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of LSD experiences. The vast majority of users experienced no lasting harm. They integrated the experience, moved on with their lives, and carried whatever insights or changes the drug had prompted without psychological collapse. The clinical research from the 1950s and early 1960s, conducted in controlled settings with psychological screening, preparation, and therapeutic support, showed adverse event rates below 1%. When LSD was given in a safe environment to psychologically stable individuals with clear intentions and trained guides, it was remarkably safe. The harm came primarily from chaotic, unsupervised use. Teenagers taking unknown doses in unstable environments, people with undiagnosed mental health conditions dosing without medical oversight, street acid cut with other compounds. Prohibition made every harm worse. With no legal channels for production, there was no quality control. Blotter paper might contain 50 micrograms or 500. It might be pure LSD or laced with PCP, amphetamines, or research chemicals with entirely different and more dangerous effects. With criminalization came stigma, and stigma prevented people from seeking help after bad experiences. Someone having a psychotic break on LSD might avoid the hospital for fear of arrest, turning a manageable crisis into lasting trauma. Compare this to alcohol, physically toxic, capable of lethal overdose, profoundly addictive, implicated in violence, liver disease, and tens of thousands of deaths annually. LSD has no lethal dose. You cannot die from LSD toxicity. It is not physically addictive. But because it carries psychological risks, it was placed in the most restrictive legal category, while alcohol remained not only legal, but culturally celebrated. This is not to say LSD is harmless. It is not. Psychological risk is a real risk. But evidence-based drug policy would recognize that prohibition does not eliminate use. It only makes use more dangerous. Regulation, education, clinical frameworks, and harm reduction could have prevented much of the damage that occurred. Instead, the choice was criminalization, which maximized danger while providing no protection to those who needed it most. For half a century, LSD remained in the darkness, but something unexpected was stirring in the labs. In 1986, a young man named Rick Doblin founded an organization with an improbable mission: to restart psychedelic research in the United States. He called it MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. At the time, the idea seemed quizzic, almost delusional. LSD and other psychedelics were Schedule I substances, classified alongside heroin as having no accepted medical use and high potential for abuse. The scientific community had abandoned the field decades earlier. The political climate remained hostile. The war on drugs was at its peak, and any suggestion that banned substances might have therapeutic value was met with ridicule or suspicion. But Doblin was patient, methodical, and willing to play the long game. He understood that restarting psychedelic research would require navigating an extraordinary bureaucratic maze. Researchers would need approval from the DEA to possess Schedule I substances, approval from the FDA to conduct human trials, approval from institutional review boards to protect research subjects, and funding sources willing to support stigmatized work. Each of these approvals could take years. Most researchers looked at the obstacles and gave up before starting. A handful did not give up. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, a small international network of scientists began submitting applications, enduring rejections, revising protocols, and slowly, incrementally convincing regulators that psychedelic research could be conducted safely and ethically. The breakthroughs came slowly, but they came. In 2008, Peter Gasser, a Swiss psychiatrist, received approval to conduct the first legal LSD therapy study in 35 years. His research focused on patients suffering from anxiety related to terminal illness, people facing death who were consumed by existential dread. 12 patients received LSD-assisted psychotherapy. The results, published in 2014, showed significant and sustained reductions in anxiety. Patients described the experience as profoundly meaningful, often the most important psychological event of their lives. They confronted their mortality and emerged with acceptance, even peace. The effects persisted for 12 months or longer. Meanwhile, in the United Kingdom, researchers at Imperial College London were using modern neuroscience tools to understand what LSD actually does to the brain. Robin Carhart Harris and David Nutt conducted fMRI studies, giving volunteers LSD and scanning their brains in real time. What they discovered was remarkable. LSD disrupted what neuroscientists call the default mode network, a collection of brain regions associated with self-referential thinking, the sense of ego, the narrative we tell ourselves about who we are. Under LSD, this network's activity decreased dramatically, while regions of the brain that normally operate in isolation began communicating with each other in novel patterns. This explains so much: the dissolution of ego boundaries, the sense of unity with the universe, the creative insights and novel connections. LSD was temporarily reorganizing the brain's functional architecture, allowing information to flow in ways that ordinary consciousness constrains. It was, in a sense, rebooting the system, shaking established patterns loose and allowing new configurations to emerge. Across the Atlantic, Johns Hopkins University had quietly assembled one of the most rigorous psychedelic research programs in the world. Roland Griffiths, a psychopharmacologist with impeccable credentials and no countercultural associations, began studying psilocybin, chemically similar to LSD but with a shorter duration and slightly gentler profile. His studies on depression, addiction, and end-of-life anxiety produced results that stunned even skeptical observers. Single psilocybin sessions, carefully prepared and therapeutically guided, produced lasting improvements in conditions that had resisted conventional treatment. Smokers who had failed to quit for decades stopped after one session. Patients with treatment-resistant depression experienced remission. The dying lost their fear. NYU and UCLA replicated the findings. The evidence became impossible to ignore. In 2017, the FDA granted psilocybin breakthrough therapy designation for treatment-resistant depression, a classification reserved for drugs that show substantial improvement over existing treatments. The designation accelerated research timelines and signaled that the federal government, despite decades of prohibition, was willing to reconsider psychedelics as medicine. Then, in 2018, Michael Pollan published How to Change Your Mind. The book was not a scientific text, but a work of narrative journalism, chronicling Pollan's own exploration of psychedelics in the renaissance of research. It became a massive bestseller, reaching audiences far beyond academia or the counterculture. Suddenly, middle-aged readers of the New York Times were learning that LSD and psilocybin were being studied at prestigious universities for legitimate medical purposes. The stigma began to crack. A Netflix documentary series followed, amplifying the message. Psychedelics were no longer fringe or forbidden knowledge. They were becoming mainstream, respectable, discussed openly in contexts of therapy and healing rather than rebellion and escape. The researchers vindicated by this renaissance had never abandoned the work, even when it cost them career advancement, funding, and professional credibility. They had believed, through decades of prohibition, that the early findings from the 1950s and 1960s were real, that the therapeutic potential had been buried by politics rather than disproven by science. Now they were being proven right. But the vindication carried a bitter edge. 50 years had been lost. 50 years during which people suffering from depression, PTSD, addiction,
and existential distress could have been helped but were not, because research had been frozen by moral panic and political expediency. 50 years during which veterans returned from wars carrying trauma that psychedelic therapy might have alleviated. 50 years during which cancer patients faced death and terror that a single guided LSD session might have transformed into acceptance. How many lives could have been different? How much suffering could have been prevented? These are not rhetorical questions. They represent quantifiable human cost, measured in decades of unnecessary pain, suicides that might have been prevented, potential that was never realized. The science was always there, waiting. It took half a century for politics to catch up. But as science reclaimed LSD, capitalism came knocking. By the late 2010s, the psychedelic renaissance had generated enough positive data that investors began paying attention. Not the idealists who had kept underground synthesis alive, not the researchers who had worked for decades with little funding or recognition, but venture capitalists, pharmaceutical executives, and biotech entrepreneurs who recognized a market opportunity. Mental health treatment was a multi-billion-dollar industry with stagnant options. Antidepressants worked for some but failed for millions. PTSD treatments showed limited effectiveness. Addiction relapse rates remained catastrophically high. If psychedelics could genuinely address these conditions, the financial potential was enormous. In 2018, Compass Pathways, a psychedelic biotech company backed by billionaire investor Peter Thiel, went public. The company focused on synthetic psilocybin, developing proprietary formulations and therapy protocols. Other companies followed rapidly. Atai Life Sciences raised hundreds of millions in funding. MindMed went public on the NASDAQ. Numinous Wellness began trading on the Canadian Stock Exchange. Between 2019 and 2021, over $3 billion in venture capital flooded into the psychedelic space. Investment conferences feature panels on psychedelic medicine. Forbes ran cover stories. Wall Street analysts issued reports projecting market valuations in the tens of billions. The language shifted accordingly. Psychedelics were rebranded as next-generation mental health treatments, stripped of countercultural associations, presented in clinical white coat terminology. Marketing materials featured brain scans and peer-reviewed citations, not tie-dye or references to consciousness expansion. This was medicine now, serious and profitable.
But the corporatization raised uncomfortable questions. These substances, psilocybin, LSD, mescaline, ayahuasca, had been used by indigenous peoples for thousands of years. The Mazatec people of Mexico had preserved the ceremonial use of psilocybin mushrooms through centuries of colonization and cultural suppression. Maria Sabina, a Mazatec curandera, had shared her knowledge with R. Gordon Wasson in 1955, an act of generosity that introduced psilocybin to Western science. Now, decades later, corporations were filing patents on psilocybin therapy protocols, synthetic analogs, and delivery mechanisms. Could traditional knowledge be patented? Should companies profit from substances that indigenous communities had stewarded as sacred medicine? Indigenous groups protested what they called biopiracy, the extraction and commodification of ancestral knowledge without consent or compensation. The Mazatec community issued statements condemning the commercialization. Their sacred mushrooms, used for healing and spiritual communion, were being reduced to intellectual property, their traditional practices dismissed as primitive, while Western clinical models were granted patents and monopolies. Rick Doblin and MAPS advocated a different model: non-profit open-source protocols, therapy training available to all practitioners, affordability prioritized over profit. But MAPS, operating on grants and donations, could not compete with venture-backed companies that raised hundreds of millions and hired armies of researchers. The for-profit firms moved faster, filed more patents, dominated the regulatory pathways toward FDA approval. The pricing concerns were immediate and stark. Academy clinics, which offered legal psychedelic-adjacent treatment for depression, charged $500 to $800 per session, often requiring multiple sessions. Insurance rarely covered it. Early projections suggested that compass psilocybin therapy, if approved, could cost $10,000 to $25,000 for a full treatment course. At those prices, only the wealthy would have access. The same drug that had been given away for free by Osley Stanley and the Brotherhood of Eternal Love in the 1960s would now be available exclusively to those who could afford premium healthcare. This created a profound moral paradox. The people most harmed by the war on drugs, Black and
Communities devastated by mass incarceration, individuals with criminal records who couldn't access traditional mental health care, would be locked out of psychedelic therapy by cost. Meanwhile, wealthy investors, many of whom had used psychedelics recreationally in college with zero legal consequences, stood to make fortunes. Silicon Valley executives microdosed LSD to boost productivity and creativity, facing no stigma, while people served decades in prison for possessing the same molecules. Some cities began pushing back. In 2019, Denver and Oakland became the first jurisdictions to decriminalize psilocybin. Oregon went further, passing Measure 109 in 2020 to legalize therapeutic psilocybin use under regulated conditions. These grassroots movements emphasized access, equity, and harm reduction over corporate profit. But decriminalization and medicalization were diverging paths, and it remained unclear whether they would eventually converge or remain permanently split. The progress was real. PTSD, depression, addiction, treatments were coming that could genuinely help people who had exhausted conventional options. Clinical trials showed remarkable efficacy. FDA approval seemed inevitable. But justice remained incomplete, compromised by the realities of American capitalism. The same substances that had been used to justify mass incarceration were now being repackaged as premium wellness products. People still sat in prison for LSD possession, while pharmaceutical companies prepared billion-dollar market launches. The psychedelic renaissance had arrived, but it carried the weight of unresolved contradictions. Indigenous knowledge commodified, countercultural pioneers forgotten, access determined by wealth, and the casualties of prohibition still locked away. As corporations patent molecules and cities decriminalize, the drug war's casualties remain. Right now, as you listen to this, there are people in federal prison serving sentences for LSD offenses, not for violence, not for theft, not for harm to others, for possessing, manufacturing, or distributing a molecule that has no lethal dose, causes no physical addiction, and is now being studied at prestigious universities as breakthrough therapy for depression and PTSD. The cognitive dissonance is staggering, but it is the reality of American drug policy, punishment and profit existing simultaneously, depending entirely on who you are and what resources you possess. The sentencing guidelines for LSD are particularly absurd, rooted in a bureaucratic quirk that has destroyed lives. Federal law calculates drug sentences by weight. For most substances, this makes some sense. A kilogram of cocaine is more serious than a gram. But LSD is active in micrograms, millionths of a gram. A single dose might weigh 100 micrograms, essentially weightless. LSD is typically distributed on blotter paper, small squares soaked in solution and dried. The DEA, when calculating sentences, counts the weight of the paper, not the drug itself. The consequences are grotesque.
1 gram of pure LSD crystal represents roughly 10,000 doses, enough to supply a small festival. But 1 gram is almost nothing in sentencing terms. However, if that same amount of LSD is absorbed in 10 grams of blotter paper, the weight used for sentencing becomes 10 grams, triggering mandatory minimums designed for heroin or cocaine trafficking. People have received life sentences for amounts of LSD that, measured by the actual drug rather than the paper carrier, would barely register. William Leonard Pickard, the Harvard-educated chemist arrested in 2000, was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. He was 60 years old at the time of arrest. The sentence was eventually reduced to 20 years after appeals, and he was released in 2020 at age 74. 2 decades in federal prison for manufacturing a substance that is now discussed openly in medical journals and featured in Netflix documentaries about therapeutic breakthroughs. Others remain inside, their names unknown, their stories untold. Approximately 1,000 people are currently incarcerated in federal prison for LSD-related offenses. State prisons hold others. Many are serving mandatory minimum sentences that allow no consideration of individual circumstances, no judicial discretion, no recognition that attitudes and science have shifted dramatically since their convictions. The racial disparities, while less pronounced than with cannabis or crack cocaine, still exist. LSD use cuts across demographics. The drug has historically been associated with white counterculture and college students. Yet enforcement, as with all drug laws, tends to target those with fewer resources, those who cannot afford expensive legal representation, those already entangled in the criminal justice system. The Silicon Valley executive who microdoses LSD to enhance creativity faces no legal risk. The underground chemist,
operating without institutional protection, faces decades behind bars for producing the identical molecule. There has been no wave of clemency, no retroactive justice as scientific consensus shifts. President Obama granted a handful of pardons for drug offenses, focusing primarily on cannabis. President Trump continued the pattern sporadically. President Biden, despite campaign promises of criminal justice reform, has granted few psychedelic-related pardons. The bureaucratic machinery grinds slowly when it moves at all, and most prisoners serving LSD sentences have no realistic path to early release. Organizations like the Last Prisoner Project have focused primarily on cannabis convictions, where the injustice is most visible and the political will strongest. But psychedelic prisoners remain largely forgotten, too few to generate political momentum, too stigmatized to attract mainstream advocacy. Their families visit them in federal facilities, their children grow up without parents, their lives are measured in years lost, potential extinguished, all for a substance that universities now administer legally in clinical trials. This is the unfinished moral equation at the heart of the psychedelic renaissance. Science returning is not enough. Corporate investment is not enough. Therapeutic breakthroughs are not enough. As long as people remain in cages for the same substances that generate billion-dollar valuations and peer-reviewed publications, the reckoning is incomplete. Justice delayed is justice denied, and for those still waiting behind bars, justice has been denied for decades. So what is LSD, really, after all of this? Strip away the propaganda, the chromosome damage that never happened, the communist plot that existed only in paranoid minds, the gateway drug mythology designed to justify prohibition. Strip away the urban legends, the teenagers who believed they were orange juice, the false stories that circulated through school assemblies and parent mornings. None of that was ever real. But also strip away the utopian myths. LSD is not the key to human evolution. It will not end war or dissolve capitalism or usher in an age of universal enlightenment. The counterculture believed these things with religious fervor, and they were wrong. Consciousness expansion does not automatically translate to social transformation. Ego dissolution during a trip does not mean ego dissolution in daily life. The insights that feel cosmically significant under the influence often evaporate upon return, leaving only the memory of significance without the content. What is LSD then, when we remove both the demonization and the deification? It is a chemical, lysergic acid diethylamide, a synthetic compound created accidentally in a Basel laboratory in 1938. It acts primarily as a serotonin 2A receptor agonist, binding to receptors in the brain that regulate perception, mood, and cognition. It is extraordinarily potent, active at doses measured in micrograms, making it one of the most powerful psychoactive substances known to science. It has no lethal dose in humans. You cannot die from LSD toxicity. It is not physically addictive. The body builds tolerance rapidly, making compulsive use self-limiting. Psychologically, LSD dissolves the boundaries that ordinarily structure consciousness. The default mode network, that collection of brain regions associated with self-referential thinking and ego maintenance, quiets dramatically.
Regions that normally operate in isolation begin communicating in novel patterns. The result is a temporary reorganization of subjective experience. Perception intensifies, thoughts accelerate and fragment, the distinction between self and environment softens, time distorts, meaning seems to saturate everything. For some people, in the right circumstances, this can be therapeutic. The dissolution of rigid thought patterns allows new perspectives to emerge. Trauma can be confronted from out its grip. Addictive behaviors can be seen clearly, their irrationality suddenly obvious. The dying can face mortality with acceptance rather than terror. These outcomes are real, documented in clinical research across decades. LSD can be a tool for healing, but it can also cause harm. In vulnerable individuals, it can trigger psychotic breaks or lasting perceptual disturbances. In chaotic settings without preparation or support, it can traumatize. It is not a substance to be used casually or without respect for its power. Context matters enormously. Set and setting. The insights of Timothy Leary that were correct even as his conclusions were not. The story of LSD was never really about the molecule. It was about us, about control and fear of what happens when consciousness is ungoverned, about the Cold War paranoia that saw mind control weapons in every chemical compound, about the generational conflict of the 1960s, when young people rejecting their parents' values became existential threats required.
Pharmaceutical explanations about the political convenience of targeting substances associated with anti-war movements and countercultural rebellion. The CIA wanted a weapon. The counterculture wanted salvation. Both projected their fantasies onto a molecule that simply does what chemistry dictates, binds to receptors, alters neurotransmission, reorganizes perception temporarily, then metabolizes and leaves. LSD itself carries no ideology, no morality, no agenda. It is inert crystal until consumed, and then it is pharmacology. Albert Hofmann, the chemist who accidentally created it, lived to 102 years old. He died in 2008, having spent the final decades of his life advocating for renewed research, calling LSD his problem child, beautiful, misunderstood, capable of good or harm depending entirely on how it was approached. He witnessed the entire arc: medical optimism, government weaponization, countercultural explosion, prohibition, and the first glimmers of scientific renaissance. He never stopped believing the problem was not the molecule, but how humans chose to use it. Can we learn from this history? Can we approach powerful tools with wisdom rather than fear or fantasy? Can we create frameworks that allow therapeutic access while preventing harm? Can we release those still imprisoned for possessing what researchers now administer legally? Can we acknowledge the indigenous knowledge that was stolen and commodified? These are not rhetorical questions. They demand answers, choices, action. The molecule still exists, inert, patient, waiting. It holds no memory of the CIA safe houses, the summer of love, the decades of prohibition, the therapeutic breakthroughs. It simply is. We carry the history. We carry the choices. We carry the responsibility for what comes next. Perhaps that was always the real trip, realizing the drug was only ever a mirror, reflecting back what we brought to it. What we saw was never the molecule. It was us.